welcome to the day.
Good evening.
Dr. Tad, trauma in the Indian context is often a misunderstood word, which often leads us to believe that we don't need the benefit of therapy. I wonder if you could help us unpack the word trauma to begin with.
Sure, and I wouldn't confine it just to your country as well. It's very ill-defined in my country as well. In our country, since we've been through a lot of wars, we tend to think of trauma as like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. People go off to war, and we get our minds around that pretty easily. I tend to find trauma, especially as the ages change, we view very differently. Okay, I remember my first PTSD patient I ever worked with. She was working in a gas station and was robbed at gunpoint, and she thought her life had flashed in front of her, but she thought, well, I'm alive. I didn't get hurt. He left without, he just left with the money, but the scars remained for years. She couldn't go back to work. She was absolutely paralyzed to go near any stores or gas stations. She basically just lived in her home and couldn't go anywhere, and that one seemed pretty understandable. But trauma can be everything from psychological trauma, growing up in abusive homes, we'll say. Maybe you were never hit, but you had the fear of being hit, or you witnessed other people you loved. It can be sexual trauma. It can be accidents. I had a patient, my very first therapy patient in my career. She committed suicide because 1 year earlier, on the anniversary of her suicide, she and her husband were in a tragic car accident. He died and she lived. She was in the car for him about 2 hours before he died. And a year later, that anniversary of that really threw her and just led to complete despair. So one of the first things when I hear about people who feel suicidal, I can hear, I want to hear about their trauma. What's really going on in your lives? And a lot of times people can't really describe that very well. They just don't have words, or they don't think of that as that was traumatic for me. We tend to want to be strong people. So when I think of, if you wanted a true definition, to make this a long-winded answer, okay, in my field, we define trauma as damage to the mind that occurs as a result of a disturbing event. Okay? In other words, it leads to changes in the brain where it impairs our future abilities to process, problem solve, and cope with similar stressors. Well, now when you think of that, that doesn't sound like these crazy responses of, oh, what can I can't do, but really more of these everyday, why can't I find the words? I get tongue-tied. I don't know how to respond in that situation.
Yes, something that a lot of people don't really understand why they experience the symptoms of trauma, because they haven't really identified what it is that they've been through. I mean, in India, it's something that, in the introduction, I said most women have experienced some sort of either sexual or physical trauma throughout the course of their life. And because it's so accepted in our society, it's sort of, buried. It's, maybe we don't always understand what it does to the science in our brains, circuitry in our brains. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. And you bring up a very specific kind of trauma, a sexual trauma, I find comes across differently oftentimes because sexual trauma becomes, in most cultures, especially for women, associated with tremendous shame. And we don't bring up things that are shameful to us. So if I have a therapy session, oftentimes people will, when I first meet them, will tell me about their lives, their relationships, and I'll ask the first session, were you ever abused, sexual abuse, physical abuse? And they're going to, of course, say no, even though when I hear their relationships, a string of patterns that I go, boy, it sure sounds like there's probably been some in here. Most of the therapists, even in America that I talk to, will say they're not going to tell me about that maybe, or to any significant, or at least not underplay it significantly, till maybe the 4th, 5th, 8th session before it finally comes up. I had a patient that it wasn't until the 8th session where she had been sexually abused by her preacher grandfather. And of course, in tremendous shame, she thought if she told, what would that do to him, the career, the whole family. But it wasn't until in a session she finally, and I knew I was just kind of picking at it, that it came out. She finally just, had to run out, throw up in the bathroom because it caused such a physical response for her. And it wasn't until her physical response happened that she really stopped minimizing it as significant severe trauma. So what kind of impacts does that have in the brain? Well, we know that trauma, to pick one circuit on the very severe level, affects the amygdala. I won't go too far down this rabbit hole unless people really ask lots of questions, okay? But with the amygdala is your fight or flight response center, where when you see something, you make a quick reaction, almost like a reflex. When the doctor hits your knee with a hammer and your leg goes, you don't think about it, it just goes. So I had a colleague who told me a story about a teacher who later became a colleague that told me a great story. He was from India, and he says, I had a friend whose father, he and his father were hiking out in the woods, and his father was bitten by a snake, and he thought it was a poisonous snake, and he ran and ran and ran, just like the wind, to go get help. His father survived, but it was very, very traumatic for him. It was a young boy. Well, for the rest of his life, he was terrified of snakes, terrified. So much so that, and it'll show how our trauma doesn't really make us, it takes away our thinking ability. So he was a very smart young man. He got a training. He moved to the States, did his residency in New York City. Well, New York City has the great famed Central Park, and it was wintertime. And if you don't know much about snow, there's not a lot of snakes involved in snow. Okay, they hibernate. So he's taking a walk with his a young gal that he's hoping to propose to someday, and he's walking and he sees this shadow of something that looks like a snake, and he just tears off running. And he forgets all about her, and he runs a couple miles away. And finally, he gets a call from her like, "What are you doing? You've abandoned me. What the heck?" So, well, he feels terrible. And he comes back and explains, "Well, I thought I saw a snake, and and I just tore it. And I thought it could kill us. Like, so you abandoned me to cover yourself?" So he felt terribly horrible. Well, they went back and looked, and all it was the tube of a bicycle tire that was kind of in the bushes. Okay, but in trauma, your brain scans every other line, okay, just like a TV used to, okay, and then it slowly fills in those pictures until it fully completes a picture. Now that happens so rapidly that we don't notice it, okay, but your brain in trauma, when you create these reflex arcs, are so fast, okay, that he just sees a bit of an outline and bam, his adrenaline hits and he's in fight or flight. Now, I can tell you, I have couples on my couches that will come in, and the minute he or she says something that hits those old responses, that fight or flight, boom, before I even figured out what they were that offended about, they are off and going into their trauma and they're fighting. Okay? And then he's mad because she can't think. She's mad because you get angry when you have an outburst. Okay? And so when you engage these circuits, you disengage right up here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. That's our area of the brain that helps us think through things and says, wait a second, would a snake really be in New York City in January? No. Okay. And am I distanced enough? And am I going to be okay? And do they have poisonous snakes in North America? Well, not in northern regions. No, we don't have them up there. So me growing up in the north, I would have known immediately, of course, it's not a snake. Okay. However, if I go to India, probably I'm scared of everything and I think everything is a snake. Okay. You guys have some terrible snakes. Well, or fascinating, depending on how you feel about snakes. So what you do see is that, yes, the brain really does recondition. And most of our trauma therapy is about getting the brain to remodel those neural circuits. That's why it can take time to do that. It takes some challenging work to do it. And so people will say, well, I don't know why I do this. And you're right, you do not know why. It's not conscious, okay? But we're going to have to change it because it's impairing your ability to be you, to be the best mom you can be, the spouse you want to be. I work with lawyers and doctors that, especially some female lawyers, that underwent sexual abuse as children. Well, now they defend those cases, and they take those cases to court, and they can't understand, why am I stuck? I'm stuck in the paperwork. I can't function, or I'm overwhelmed. This should be an easy case, because all their trauma is coming out, and they can hardly function, and it's all in the background, and they don't see it. So those are just a few of the ways it can affect the brain. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's incredible that it impacts our ability to think, and so we don't understand why we're behaving a certain way. So that's incredible to understand the psychology of it. Can you explain a little bit more about the mind-body impact?
Sure, and that's a really important thing that we're just really seeing now in the data and science. There was a really important radiographer, okay, a person who images the brain out of Washington University, and she had fantastic data. And what she showed was she took a study of women, and why women? Well, for women, because they show up for studies better. Okay, men aren't so great at this. Women are really. You really want to have studies with lots of women in them because they actually show up on time and it makes it very easy. Okay, and they tell you good histories and stories about their lives. They track these things. So what she looked at was people who'd had depression, not necessarily been treated or not treated, but what she found was the longer your depression, not the severity, but the length of time of depression, caused atrophy, or in other words, like when you have a muscle that starts to shrink, it's been in a cast, that's atrophy. She found that you would get atrophy in the brain. And what area she noted was the hippocampus of the brain, this area right in here. Okay, and that's the hard drive of your brain. And what she found is by 5 years of time, and oftentimes these people had mild to moderate depressions, but they just kept them for years, never really got better. Okay, and it didn't matter if they were treated or not. It was how many years of depression you'd had. Okay, that you were in. Okay. What she found was you could have up to 35 to 45% atrophy in that area of the brain. Well, if you think about that, if you're missing randomly 35% of your hard drive, could you imagine how well your computer would do? Obviously. And so I find people with depression, they'll find problems where I can't think of this. I keep losing thoughts, and I'm like, you're only 40 years old. This should not be happening. Okay. The other thing so that was really incredible news to a lot of us psychiatrists that said, we changed how we were treating. I used to have people come to me that say, well, when your depression's, mild, but you really don't be treated. When it gets bad enough, come tell me. We'll deal with it. Now I find let me hit it right away because it's damaging your brain. You wouldn't want to have a lot of mild heart attacks for a long period of time. You want to jump on that right away, get ahead of it. The other thing we found was that area of the brain was one of the primary areas of glucocorticoid receptors. Well, what does that mean? Fancy words. Well, that means that's one of the areas that's in control of controlling blood sugar levels or glucose levels in the body. So we realized we could never figure out why do people with depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia have 2 to 4 times higher rates of diabetes. Well, we realized all 3 of those have much higher rates of depression, and we started connecting the mind-body. We always knew serotonin had big effects on the gut because your GI tract has more serotonin receptors than your brain does. Although we're oftentimes in trauma, we're playing with serotonin receptors, trying to downplay or repair some of the damage in the neural circuits that happens with trauma. So we're finally connecting the brain and the body, which I always thought was weird because when I looked in the mirror, mine was connected. And mine with a very short neck, it was a very short connection. So I thought it must really be connected, so.
Yes. I guess
so that might be a little more neurobiology than maybe some of your guests really wanted. Sorry, but to me, these are exciting things. We become nerds sometimes at this stuff. Yeah.
I think it's really great for us to really understand that. And when we understand how the mind-body has a connection, and we realize that the length of time that we suffer has an impact on our healing, then we want to deal with the issues that plague us rather than bury it. So that's a really good reason for us to do that.